get started with today's episode, I would like to quickly read you our podcast disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not to substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. You should always speak with your physician or other healthcare professionals before doing any fasting, changing your diet in any way, taking or adjusting any medications or supplements, or adopting any treatment plan for a health problem. The use of any other products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Any information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. All right, and now we'll get started with today's episode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Chance, and I'm a fasting coach here with TFM. And today we are with our very own Dr. Jason Fung for our monthly Q&A. Hi, Dr. Fung.
Hi.
And a warm welcome to our podcast listeners who will be able to listen to this Q&A with Dr. Fung in a few weeks after our community members. This is a monthly Q&A where he answers questions submitted by our TFM community members. So I have a few questions here for you. I got a lot of questions. I don't think I've had so many questions before. So let's see how many we can get to. This person says, imagine that I dressed a carb that I eat by adding acid and fat so that my blood sugar spike is minimized. Say a potato with vinegar and olive oil, or maybe eating berries with heavy cream. What happens to all the fat that I added? Does the carb send the body the signal for insulin to go up, and consequently for all the fat that I've added to go directly to body fat? Or is this something that I should minimize the amount of fat when I do dress carbs? We say no naked carbs, right? And mostly eat them with acid like vinegar and lemon juice.
So dietary fat, the way it's absorbed is that it absorbs through the intestines into the lymphatic system, and it sort of then gets distributed into the body fat. It sort of gets absorbed pretty much directly as opposed to glucose, which is processed in the liver, but glucose goes up, the insulin goes up, and so on. So it's a little bit more complex, but the dietary fat does go straight in. So if your goal is to lose body fat, then adding a lot of fat does work against you, obviously. But the thing is that the reason why the keto diet was successful in a lot of people, which is a high fat diet, is that what drives a lot of fat storage, the body senses how much body fat you have and sort of adjusts it. So if your body fat goes up, your body senses that and tries to bring that weight down. So if you do force feeding studies, when you force feed people to gain weight, they do gain weight, but their appetite goes way down so that when you take them off the force feeding, they naturally go back to that normal weight. Same thing with the fat. Yes, it will go into the body fat. So if you're trying to lose fat, it's not great for you, but it doesn't sort of adjust that body set weight up or down, whereas the insulin is sort of what sets it up or down. So if it goes up, then your body is trying to be at a higher level, right? It's like a thermostat in a room. So if you think about the thermostat in your room, you set it to a certain temperature, and it will automatically adjust to that temperature. Body fat percentage is the same. Your body has a certain body fat percentage which it wants to be at. If you simply add fat, yes, you will gain fat, but your body will sense that and try and get you back to that thermostat. Just like if you have a room, you set it at room temperature, but you bring a portable heater in. The thermostat will sense it and then try and turn on the air conditioning to cool it, right? To maintain that temperature. So it's a difference of adding body fat, losing body fat, but it's the insulin which raises or lowers that set weight. You know that because when you give people insulin, you're not giving them any calories, because I see so many arguments. Oh, it's all about calories. It's all about calories. that's not what controls how much body fat you have. It's not the calories. That's why nobody has counted calories, until the 1980s or whatever. And people had a good weight because they didn't need to. Your body automatically set it, right? So if your body is at a certain weight, if your weight is a certain level and you ate too many calories, your body would sense that and make you less hungry so that you ate less calories to bring it down. So yes, it eventually comes down to calories, but that's not the controlling factor. Just like in a room, it's about the thermostat, not about how much heat you bring in and how much cooling. Whereas, the people who focus on calories are like the people who say it's all about heat in versus heat out. It's like, no, it's about adjusting the thermostat, right? And that's where the insulin is important. So yes, when you eat body fat, it does go into body fat, but that's not really what controls your body fat percentage, right? People who think about fat in, fat out, calories in, calories out, assume that it's not regulated, but it is regulated. What we're trying to do is adjust what's regulating the body fat percentage, which is ultimately the insulin, which is important. On the other hand, if you overdo it, because for a while people used to say, oh, you should eat these fat bombs. I'm like, there's no point eating fat if you're not hungry or for no reason. It doesn't do you any good. You don't want to do that. So yes, I think if you dress your carbs with fat, it's still okay, unless it leads to you sort of overeating. And that happens mostly when you're having a lot of processed fats. Like, if you have a donut or something, which is basically carbs fried in oil. You've got the fat and the carbs, but it's highly refined. That's the real issue, as opposed to eating potato salad with some butter, right? That's probably better than just straight potato salad because it's going to give you less insulin effect. So it's really about the insulin, and that's where insulin is sort of the more important factor. It does eventually comes down to calories and stuff, but it's what controls those calories.
By the way, I did watch what I'm going to call part 2 of the body fat thermostat. So this is the second one that you've done on it, the latest YouTube video. And our members can get that through the blogs, but other people can certainly go straight to YouTube. But it's great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I recently gained some weight and I was struggling to get it off. And one of the things that I did was I switched all my fat to real food fat.
Yeah.
Instead of any kind of processed fat, even the low carb fats, the natural fats that are somewhat minimally processed. I'm just getting it just straight from food now, and the weight came off. So it was interesting, an interesting experiment, not having that.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why I think people talking about like ultra processed foods and stuff, because the processing does something, and it's not really just about it's not just about the carbs and stuff. It's the way it affects our hormones, which is what affects. So it's not just insulin actually, but there's GLP-1 and there's peptide YY and cholecystokinin, and there's a whole bunch of hormones, although insulin is the primary one. Cortisol is another one, of course, but affecting those can make a big difference in how you do it. And of course, that's how people used to do it, right? They didn't count calories. They just ate a natural food in a natural sort of rhythm.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
This person asks, what eating strategy would you suggest for someone who is insulin resistant or pre-diabetic? In other words, do they need to do lower carb to get out of the pre-diabetic range?
I focus on the insulin effect. If you have too much insulin, you get this insulin resistance and so on. So you're trying to lower insulin. And one of the ways is to reduce the total number of carbs, but that's not the only way. That's, again, only one of the factors. Eating more refined carbs, for example, less processed carbs, it makes a difference. What you eat it with makes a difference. So you can eat the same food. And there's a number of these things where you can take the same food, same total number of carbs, and depending on how you eat them, your insulin effect will be much higher or much lower. So that's important because it's not simply reducing the total number of carbs, which is a very good strategy, of course. But even if you take the same number of carbs, you can change the insulin effect of those carbs. With vinegar, for example, you can significantly reduce the insulin effect, even though the total number of carbs is the same. If you're to eat pure carbs versus carbs with other things, proteins and fats, as part of a whole meal, again, it makes a big difference. Eating the carbs later in the meal versus, so if you take your vegetables first and then the carbs, that makes a difference. If you eat later in the day versus early in the day, makes a big difference. So if you look at refined carbs, you can make a huge difference in terms of the insulin effect. In fact, you can take the same food. They did this experiment where they took oatmeal and they had high glycemic versus intermediate glycemic index. The high glycemic index one was instant oatmeal, and the medium glycemic index was steel cut oats. So the exact same food, which is oatmeal, but one is processed, highly processed, cut into shredded and ground up very fine so you absorb it very quickly, versus steel cut oats. There's a huge difference in the glycemic effect, which is measurable, which you can find anywhere on the internet, which translates into a much lower insulin effect. Because if your sugar's not spiking up, then your insulin's not spiking up. So the exact same foods, the exact same carbohydrates makes a big difference. So refined, all these different things will affect the insulin effect. So you don't necessarily have to affect the total number of carbs, although that is a good way to do it. If you can't do it, then there are other things. Resistant starch is another way. So heating and then cooling the carbohydrates reduces the insulin effect. So there's all these different ways. And when you think about it, it actually winds up being something which has actually, you find in a lot of traditional practices. For example, don't eat late at night, don't eat late night snacks. I mean, that's traditional advice. And it turns out it's very good advice. Eat your carbohydrates with other things, or you may have salad first, start with a salad and then have your main, so all of these sort of advice, eat unprocessed foods other than processed foods. So all of these things that are very, can affect the insulin effect without affecting the total number of carbohydrates. So those are things that you can actually make a difference on as well.
Yeah. My girlfriend is a retired diabetic educator, and her husband is type 2 diabetic on insulin. And she had him recently just change from having instant oatmeal to not steel cut, but more old fashioned, so less processed. So then he doesn't raise his blood sugar right off the bat, first thing in the morning. And then he's not as hungry later. He can sustain longer without having to need something to eat pretty soon.
Yeah. See, the thing is that if you take instant oats versus steel cut oats, and they did this experiment, Dr. David Ludwig from Harvard did this. What happens with the instant oats is that you spike your glucose and your insulin way up. But then what happens is it crashes, right? So by 10:30 in the morning, what happens is that your sugars are actually going low. So you're getting shaky because you're hypoglycemic, you're getting this hunger. And then that's going to make you eat, right? And then everybody says, it's about the calories. It's like, no, it was about the fact that it was a refined carbohydrate. So instead of that, if you take the steel cut oats or even the whole oats, for example, you can boil them. It's the same carbs, same calories, the same food itself, but you get this slower peak in glucose. You don't get this big crash that comes later on. You don't get hungry, keeps you full right through, and maybe you eat less at lunch, which is what they showed, right? So yes, you do wind up eating less calories, but the important thing wasn't the calories. The important thing was the processing of the food, because that's what led you to eat more calories. That's what those calories people never understand, because they're all like, well, you could eat instant oats and regular oats and then control your calories and it'll be the same. It's like, yes, you can, but that's not real life. Real life is that you eat the processed, highly processed instant oats. You get the big crash, or you eat, white bread and jam. You get the big crash at 10:30. Then you go and eat a muffin, get that big spike, the big crash, makes you hungry, So the real world is that you need to look at these things, which is the number of carbs. So if you switch from the oats to, say, a vegetable omelet, it's way better, right? By controlling the number of carbs, you can do that. But you can also control it to a lesser degree by eating unprocessed foods, eating other foods with it, the acid, and eating later versus earlier, that kind of thing, right? So that's why it's really important to look at it, which is always why it strikes me. I saw this debate the other day where it's just like, oh, it's all about calories. As a cardiologist, I'm like, God, you just don't understand. Like, you don't understand, and you're so aggressive in your ignorance of what the real world, like, do you honestly believe that nobody has thought about that? And, that people who have lost weight just don't understand calories. Like, do you not know that people trying to lose weight are obsessed with calories? Like, do you get that? Do you understand how obsessed people are? And it hasn't helped them. So why are you trying to belittle people about, oh, if you lose weight, it must be because you're eating less calories than you're spending? Like, I know that. It's like, it's just not useful advice because you're not controlling what controls the calories. Why are you eating too many calories? Not that you're eating too many calories more than you're expending. It's why is the calories in over your calories out? And it's because your body is trying to make you increase calories in over calories out. Why? Because you've increased that thermostat with your hormones, and your body is now driving you to this. Right. And it's like, oh, I see these doctors and these experts, usually some bro scientists out there. It's all about calories, all about calories, all about calories. Like, God, like, you are not an expert in calories. Ask anybody who's losing weight. They are 10 times more expert in how many calories every single food has.
Yeah.
You know that, and I know that. Talk to anybody.
Oh, yeah.
Like, but these people just don't get it.
I counted calories for this first 7 months of this program because I was so worried, because I've been counting calories for 50 years.
Yeah.
And I know what's in calories in food, and it made no difference. I looked at week to week, month to month, how fast I was losing, what I was losing, and calories were not a factor in all that data. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
So I have a long question here for you. This person says, I'm struggling with getting my blood sugars down to a normal range, and I'm stalled in my weight loss. I have had a lot of success with TFM over the last couple of years. I have lost 150 pounds, gotten off insulin and other oral medications. I feel like my way of eating is on point about 95% of the time. I'm fasting 24 to 48 hours. I do that 2 or 3 times a week. And then I also do extended fasts occasionally. In my last extended fast, my blood sugar did not come down until day 3, and then started going up every day. And by day 5, my blood sugar was 189. I broke my fast with whole food carbs, and my blood sugar came down into the 140s. And I'm wondering why now, so far into my journey, would things be going wonky? I do have a lot of personal and family stress happening right now. Could that emotional turmoil be causing enough cortisol that it's negating my diet and my fasting? I don't like that she used the word diet, but I'll say my eating strategies and my fasting. Are there other general explanations of what could be contributing to this so far into the game?
Yeah, there's 2 things. One is that for sure, stress can be a major, major factor. Fasting does increase cortisol, and that's important because cortisol can raise blood sugar. So when you fast, cortisol goes up, and the point of cortisol is to push sugar into the system so that you have energy. If you have high blood sugars already, then of course it can work against you. But on the other hand, the whole idea is that for some people, backing off a little bit can be useful because maybe it's just too much and the cortisol is going up higher in addition to the stress, and therefore it's sort of overwhelming that other effect, right? So the stress can be a major factor in that. The other thing that you have to think about, especially if you have diabetes, is whether or not it's actually type 2 diabetes. Because what we do see more and more of is this latent autoimmune disease in adults, LADA, which is essentially a type 1 diabetes picture where your insulin levels are actually quite low. So if you have type 2 diabetes, insulin levels are very high. Therefore, treatments like fasting, which lower insulin, can actually completely reverse the disease. We see it all the time. But if your insulin levels are low, then fasting is not going to be nearly as effective because your insulin levels are low and you're giving a treatment that lowers insulin. So it doesn't really help. So that's the thing to think about. Cortisol is one of them. Backing off on the fasting might be actually a better strategy because you're going to have less of that stress. Because remember, fasting is a stress on the body. Stress on the body is not necessarily a bad thing. It's like exercise. Exercise is a stress, and your body responds by getting stronger. So fasting is a stress too, and you respond by getting better. But if you overdo it, just like exercise, it can be bad for you. So certainly you have to play around. Everybody's so individual. You always have to see how your own body reacts to it. And if it's not reacting in the right way, then you change it up and see what really works for you. But checking a fasting insulin level is sometimes useful because if it's low or low normal, then it may not be typical type 2 diabetes. And sometimes they're very hard to tell apart. So just be aware of that.
Thank you. So I did do a little bit of research on this after this person sent this in. They wanted to know if you had any evidence, empirical or otherwise, on fasting, autophagy, and reduced carbohydrate intake for people who have ADPKD. So I'm going to let you describe that. But I did find one article that shows that fasting and time-restricted eating actually will help reduce the cyst growth. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so this is autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. It's a genetic disease. So if you have it, then your kids will get it. But that's how the disease is. It's a genetic error. So what happens is people develop these cysts in the kidneys. They eventually grow very large and destroy the kidney. What's interesting is that cyst growth can be affected by fasting. So remember that fasting, when you don't eat, you actually your body goes into sort of a maintenance mode as opposed to a growth mode. So if you turn off the growth signaling, then presumably the cysts will also grow less fast, and therefore you can slow down the cyst growth, which can then help preserve kidney function. So the question is whether it works in adults, and we don't actually know. There were 2 rat studies that showed that if you put these rats onto a fasting regimen, that you could practically stop the growth of the cyst completely. The problem with rat studies is that they don't always translate into humans, and rat metabolism is much faster. So a 24-hour fast in a rat is not the same as a 24-hour fast in a human. It's probably closer to like 5 days sort of thing, right? It's not just a little bit, it's quite a bit. But the idea is that when you don't eat anything, your body says, oh, I need to stop growing because there's no food available, right? And that's a natural response. That's what we expect to happen. Insulin is not only a metabolic hormone, it's also a growth hormone. So in evolutionary terms, insulin was initially used when it first came up in evolution as a growth factor, not as a metabolic hormone. It was only later on that the body evolved to use it both as a nutrient sensor, so it senses the availability of nutrients, as well as a growth signal. So you need to have food coming in for you to grow. That's why it's the exact same signal. So when insulin goes up, it not only tells you to, move glucose into the body, it tells you to start growing, which is why that it's a nutrient sensor. That's why when you take insulin, your body starts storing fat and it blocks fat burning, right? It blocks lipolysis. It also increases growth. So if you give insulin to babies, for example, like children of diabetic mothers, they are bigger than normal. They're huge, actually. They can be like 9-10 pounds because the insulin has signaled the fetus to grow very quickly. So it gets bigger than normal. Large for gestational age is what it's called. So anyway, insulin is a growth factor, but the reason it's more powerful than just insulin is that you also turn off mTOR, which is also a nutrient sensor for protein. And therefore, if you're not eating any carbs or proteins, you're lowering your insulin signaling, you're lowering your mTOR signaling, which then will tell your body, hey, everything needs to stop growing. And the fastest growing things in the body here are the cysts. So the cysts also stop growing. That's the theory. And how much fasting you need to do, how often you need to do it, it's anybody's guess because it's mostly rat studies that have done it. Most people who are doing fasting are not doing the extended fast that would be the equivalent of the rat studies. And these studies take forever because this disease manifests over decades. It's a genetic disease, but you don't see cysts until you're around 28, 29, maybe 25. So it takes a couple decades for you to even get the cysts, and it takes a couple more decades for you to get a lot of cysts. So because those studies are virtually impossible to do, nobody actually knows. But theoretically, it could stop polycystic kidney disease.
Very interesting. I didn't know about the growth that they were attached, the insulin and the hunger. Now, this member is actually a physician asking in regards to her patients. So I don't think we've ever had a question like this before from a physician that's a member. If they have a client with gallstones, can they fast? And if so, does it increase the risk of gallstones? And what is the best fasting link for someone like that?
There's no good studies on fasting and gallstones. The thing about gallstones is that it can happen sort of at any time. The gallbladder, which is underneath the liver, can sometimes get stones. People used to worry about ketogenic diets. So remember, the gallbladder holds bile acids, and bile acids are used to metabolize fat. So when you eat fat, it's not water soluble because it's fat, right? Oil and water don't mix. So when you eat fatty food like butter or olive oil or something, you can't actually mix it with the normal digestive enzyme. So you use bile, which responds to fat. So people used to say, well, that's not good. You can get gallstones. But of course, the point is that low-fat diets actually cause a lot of gallstones because you're eating low fat. You don't need that much bile. Your bile's just sitting in your gallbladder. You're not using it. It stagnates and then you get stones, right? So if you're eating a higher fat diet, you're always pushing a little bit of bile into the stomach. So it's not just all sitting there getting stones. During fasting, of course, you're not eating anything, but that shouldn't make a big difference. Like the bile will still sit there, but it's not going to push out. So the gallstone's going to get pushed out and get stuck. So you can still do it when fasting, but obviously when you're eating, you should make sure you eat some fat so that you do have some. It's not something that's well studied because it's not generally something that develops short term. It's usually a long term issue, right? So it's not like if you eat a low fat diet for a couple of weeks, you're not going to get gallstones, but you eat it for like a decade, then you could, because the bile's just sitting in the gallbladder and then eventually form a stone. So fasting is the same. You're not going to fast for like 2 months, right? So the bile's not just sitting there. So you just want to make sure you're not eating a super low fat diet when you're eating. And then any of the shorter fasting methods is perfectly fine. 16 hours, 24 hours, even a day. It's not going to make a difference. As long as you're eating some fat the next meal, then you're going to move some of that bile out. And then that's going to help prevent the stones from forming. If they formed already, then yes, it can get stuck. But, the point is that you want to try and prevent it from getting formed. That's why, when we switched everybody to a low-fat diet in the 80s, remember the 80s, right? It was super low-fat everything. Everybody thought, wow, gallstones are going to be great because you don't need bile. The problem was that because you didn't need the bile, it was all just sitting there and then it could form a stone because of the stasis. So it's not a short-term issue, so it doesn't affect the fasting very much. So in my experience, nobody's really complained that they've had more gallstones because of the fasting. Over my career, I've seen a lot less people with gallstones used to be everybody had gallstones, right? Like every single person. But then as we moved away from that fanatical sort of low fat era of the 80s and 90s, in the last 10 years, as people have become less and less worried about fat, right? They called it healthy fats. And then people started eating avocados and Mediterranean diets, which are high in fat. I really haven't seen, like, the number of people with gallstones I've seen have dropped fairly dramatically. So it was really the militant low-fat diet, which was probably the most important factor. Fasting probably is a minor factor in the whole thing.
Oh, I remember the 80s very well because we would get a lot of people coming in with gallstones, fair, fat, and 40, right? And female, often. And they would say, but I'm not eating fat. And I'm like, bingo. Because you're fat, you're not eating fat. And then here they are. Then they have an occasion where they have the fat and they don't know how to process it. It's all clogged up there. And so then they're really in trouble. Then they're in the emergency room.
Yeah, it was funny because that's, what they taught us too, which is that female fat 40, right? And it was funny because It's probably because they were probably much better at following the low-fat diet. The
Mm-hmm.
men probably weren't listening, so they didn't get the gallstones as much. And then because they're eating low-fat, they were actually gaining weight because it was all those carbs, right? Because remember, we weren't recommending low, naturally processed food. People were eating like, white bread and stuff. So the whole thing was all bad because a lot of it was driven by this super low fat, super high refined carb diet, the increase in weight and the increase in gallstones. The sad part is that they were actually doing exactly what we told them to do. And when they got all these problems, people were like, you didn't do it well enough. You weren't eating low fat. When it was actually
Instead, they were doing exactly right.
they were doing exactly, and all the men were just not following the diet because they wanted their hamburger and didn't have the same problems, right? So
They were sneaking out to have their hamburger. I heard a lot. I had a lot of girlfriends who said he went out and
yeah, it was a sad sort of thing.
Speaking of oil, this person says, I have a question about cooking oils. I know seed oils are not recommended, but what do you think about cold press niger, Niger? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. Seed oil. Avocado oil is not readily available in my country, and I cannot use butter or animal fat every day as there are a minimum of 180 religious fasts a year. These fasts prohibit dairy products and meat, so we are basically vegans during these fasts. Do you have any insight on, am I saying it right, Dr. Fung?
Don't know much about that actually. So it's not something that I use actually. I don't know if it's something that's available here easily. And of course, I mostly use olive oil. I'm not that familiar with it. However, my own bias is that anything that you can squeeze, so if you're doing a cold pressed oil, it's probably okay because it's fairly natural. So remember, the whole problem with the seed oil is that you're processing tons, any of the seed oil. So corn is not oily. Neither are sunflowers. Neither is cottonseed. None of those are actually oily. So what you do is you process tons and tons of corn and stuff. And then because you're processing so much, you've got, whatever else you have, you're getting overwhelming the natural ability to handle it, because the way they make these seed oils is generally that you have to process a ton of stuff, then you have to sort of purify it and all this, deodorize it and all this. There's a whole process. It's a terribly industrial process. So what you get is this very unnatural food, which is essentially ultra processed, right? Corn oil, cottonseed oil, they're ultra processed, right? And that's what happens, is that you wind up going around the body's natural sort of defenses, because your body knows how to handle natural foods. So anything that sort of is, you squish it and you get an oil, which is olive oil, right? That's first press, right? Don't get any of the other stuff, because then they process the hell out of it to get more oil. But anything that you squeeze and get oil is natural enough that your body sort of knows how to handle it, and therefore you're not going to have any problems, right? So if this is a cold pressed seed oil, my guess is that it's going to be okay. Cold pressed avocado oil is probably okay, but tends to be on the expensive side. Given how, I don't know if you've seen it, but in Toronto, the prices of avocado have gone through the roof. So I don't know how anybody even affords avocado oil, because it's like, unless they're processing the seed, which then I would say probably best not to do it. But if it's just like cold pressed avocado, I don't even know how, like, avocados are like super mega expensive. They were expensive before, but now they're really expensive. So it's like, I don't know how you can even afford a bottle of avocado oil anymore, because the cost to make it must be astronomical, because each avocado these days is like $1 for this tiny one. Most of them are $2.50 now in the supermarket. So I would eat avocados. I'm not sure how they make the avocado oil. If it's just cold pressed, then it's probably fine. The other thing is the Niger seed a natural food or not? Because even if you cold press it and you get oil, if it's not a natural food, then you're probably better off avoiding it, because your body, again, is not going to be able to handle it. Olives, of course, are natural food, so therefore it's fine. Butter is fine, all of those things. So I don't know enough about the Niger seeds itself, but that's what I would probably say about that.
Thank you, Dr. Fung. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
I kept you over a little bit. So this one, I'm kind of curious about your answer. Why do some people who have never missed a meal in their life and they suddenly start to do a multi-day fast get very high ketones right away and have to break their fast?
I don't know. Everybody actually is quite different on this, which is always kind of funny. So there may be other factors at work, but what happens when you don't eat during a fast is that the glucose goes down, and then there's a period in between where you're sort of just in between, and you do a bit of gluconeogenesis, and then the fat mat oxidation starts. So then that's when you really ramp up the ketones and stuff. For some reason, some people are quite good at that and some people are not very good at that. There is this thing called metabolic flexibility, which is that how easily you're able to switch from one to the other. So if you're able to do it very quickly, then that's generally a sign of a very healthy mitochondria, because the mitochondria is what adjusts the energy input, right? Even if you don't miss a meal, I mean, you can still be metabolically healthy. Like people in the 60s and 70s, they ate 3 meals a day, but it was all natural foods. It wasn't a lot of food. They weren't eating excessively. They're just eating naturally. That's something that if they have good metabolic flexibility, then their ketones should go up right away. That is, their body, their mitochondria is able to switch glucose to fat very easily. On the other hand, you get people with very bad metabolic flexibility. So weight is probably a factor in it, but it's probably a lot more than that. But their metabolic flexibility, for some reason, is very poor. And what happens is that when your glucose runs out, the ketones and the fat hasn't kicked in. So then there's this prolonged period of time where you're really running on low energy here, because you can do a bit of protein for gluconeogenesis, but your fat hasn't kicked in, which it's supposed to. And I've seen people who have measured it and they've gone 3 days of fasting before their ketones started to tick up. So clearly their metabolic flexibility is on the low side. And then during that period, they're like, well, I feel very tired and, I can't work out, because it's like you can't burn glucose because that's gone, and you can't burn fat because you haven't really kicked in yet. There's nothing to do but sort of shorten that fast and try and build up your metabolic flexibility by doing it. If you have very high metabolic flexibility, presumably you can kick in right away and then your body starts metabolizing fat right away. Probably a good thing. I mean, you don't have to cut it down if you have ketones. Like, that's just natural. So you could fast longer if you want to, but if you're worried about it, then just stop it.
I know when I first started, I hardly ever made any ketones. And if I did make them, I used them, I'm sure, for my brain, for my migraines. I'd knock myself out of ketosis. It would take 2 or 3 weeks to get back in. Then it became 1 week, then 3 days. Then I could just have a fats meal. And now I basically eat plant-based. I would call it moderate low carb. And I still blow ketones every day now. I have become that improved on my metabolic flexibility.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Fung. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's probably important, because metabolic flexibility is probably an earlier signal compared to prediabetes and so on. So, a lot of disease comes down to mitochondrial health, and that flexibility is a sign that the health of the mitochondria is probably improved. So that's very good if you have noticed that.
So thanks again. I really appreciate you coming and talking to us every month. I learned a lot today myself. So always fun to talk to you, Dr. Fung.
You too.
Please feel free to send in your questions if you are a TFM member. So thank you, Dr. Fung. See you next month.
Bye.
Bye.